This house isn't yours anymore, old man. Grant's voice bounced off the kitchen tile like a slap. He had a folder in his hand, papers sticking out at the corners, and he was smiling the way a man smiles when he thinks the game is already over. You're going to want to sit down for this, Walter. I did not sit down. I looked at my wife standing behind him, her face white as the countertop, and I understood in that instant that something had been built behind my back for a very long time. What Grant did not know was that 3 years ago, my late wife had made me promise to keep a folder of my own. And that folder had been sitting in a fireproof box in my attorney's vault since before Grant had ever set foot in this house. Thank you so much for being here with me tonight. If you're new to this channel, welcome, and if you've been here before, you know how much it means to me that you keep coming back. Drop a comment and let me know what city or country you're watching from tonight. I read every single one. And before we go further, a quick note. This story blends real patterns of elder financial abuse with dramatized details, names, and settings created for storytelling. Any resemblance to a specific person is coincidental, but the lessons inside it are very real. Let's begin. My name is Walter Ellison. I am 71 years old, and for 41 of those years I worked as a structural engineer, the kind of man who got called out to inspect bridges after storms and buildings after earthquakes, the kind of man whose entire career depended on one simple rule: you do not trust a structure just because it looks solid on the surface. You test the load. You check the foundation. You find the hairline crack before it becomes the reason a roof falls in on someone's head. I mention this because it matters later. Because for 4 decades I was paid very well to notice the things other people walked past without seeing. And then, in my own home, in my own family, I nearly missed the biggest crack of my life. I built the house on Birchgate Lane with my first wife, Margaret, in the spring of 1987. We were young then, and broke, and the bank almost didn't approve us. Margaret used to joke that she talked the loan officer into it by bringing him a pie every Tuesday for 6 weeks straight until he signed. I believed her. Margaret could talk anyone into anything, except, in the end, into believing she wasn't as sick as she was. She fought ovarian cancer for 2 years and lost that fight on a rainy October morning 4 years ago, in the same bedroom where our son had been born and where, decades later, I would come within one very close call of losing everything she and I had spent our lives building. For the better part of a year after she died, I did not know what to do with myself. I kept her side of the closet exactly as it was. I kept her reading glasses on the nightstand. I went to the grocery store and bought her brand of tea out of habit and then stood in my kitchen holding the box, not sure what to do with grief that had nowhere left to go. It was Reverend Aldous Pratt from Cedar Hollow Community Church who finally convinced me to come to the Tuesday grief group in the church basement, and it was there, over bad coffee and worse folding chairs, that I met Paula Whitmore. Paula had lost her husband, Richard, to a heart attack 3 years before I lost Margaret. She had a laugh that came out of nowhere and surprised you, the kind of laugh that made the whole room feel lighter, and she had a grown son named Grant who, at the time, seemed like nothing more than a slightly distant 34-year-old who called his mother every Sunday and showed up for holidays with a bottle of wine and a tight, polite smile. Paula and I married on a Saturday afternoon in June, 18 months after we met, in the backyard of the house I had built with Margaret. I know how that might sound to some of you. I have made peace with it. Margaret used to tell me, in her last months, that she did not want me to spend the rest of my life eating dinner alone. Paula gave me a reason not to. What I did not fully understand, not at first, was what my remarriage had done to the math in Grant Whitmore's head. Grant ran a boat brokerage out of the marina in Ashford Cove, or at least he told people he did. What I would later learn, piece by piece, over the course of one of the worst summers of my life, was that the brokerage had been hemorrhaging money for 2 years, that Grant had taken out a second mortgage on his own condominium to cover a bad investment in a marina expansion project that never got permits, and that a man named Corbin Slate, a man who called himself a senior transition consultant and who Grant had met at a business networking event 8 months before any of this began, had looked at my paid-off house on Birchgate Lane, at my pension, at my age, and at my new marriage to Grant's mother, and had seen something a great deal simpler than a family. He had seen an asset with a soft, sentimental door standing wide open. I did not know any of that on the Tuesday evening in early May when Grant stood in my kitchen holding a folder and told me the house wasn't mine anymore. What I knew was what any of you would know: that the floor had, without warning, tilted underneath me. Let me take you back 6 weeks before that moment, because that is where this story actually starts, and because I want you to see it unfold the way I lived it, slowly, and then all at once. Before any of that, though, I want to introduce you to Mrs. Doris Okafor, because without her, I am not certain I would have started paying attention in time. Doris had lived next door to Margaret and me since 1994, a retired postal worker with sharp eyes and a garden she tended like it owed her money. She caught me at my mailbox on the evening of Thursday, April 24th, her expression tighter than her usual easy warmth. "Walter," she said, glancing back toward my driveway like she wanted to make sure no one was listening, "I don't mean to pry, but your stepson's car has been in your driveway an awful lot lately on evenings your wife's out. Every Tuesday and Thursday, regular as a clock, for about a month now. I only mention it because Richard, my husband, God rest him, used to say a pattern is the first thing worth noticing and the last thing anybody bothers to." I told her I appreciated it, that Grant was just helping out with some paperwork, and I meant it when I said it. Doris nodded slowly, the way people do when they've decided not to push further than a first warning allows, patted my arm once, and went back to deadheading the marigolds along her porch steps, and I stood at my own mailbox a moment longer than I needed to, turning her words over without yet understanding why they had settled somewhere uneasy in my chest. But I want you to understand that the seed she planted that evening did not fully take root for another 2 weeks. That is how these things work. They do not announce themselves. They accumulate, quietly, the way rust accumulates on the underside of a bridge joint, invisible until the day the inspector finally thinks to turn his flashlight at the right angle. It was 3 days after that conversation with Doris, on the morning I could not account for the missing 2.5 hours between 6:30 and 9 o'clock, that I finally started keeping the notebook. I want to be honest that I almost didn't. There is a particular kind of shame that comes with suspecting your own family, a shame that whispers you are being paranoid, ungrateful, unfair to people who love you. I sat with that shame for the better part of a week before I understood that the shame itself was doing exactly what it was designed to do, keeping me quiet long enough for whatever was happening to finish happening. Margaret used to say that guilt and shame make excellent locks, because the person carrying them installs the lock on their own door and then hands the only key to whoever put the guilt there in the first place. I did not fully understand what she meant until I caught myself, that week, apologizing silently in my own head to a stepson who had not yet done anything I could prove, simply for the crime of noticing him too closely. Tuesday, March 19th, 6:40 in the evening. I remember the date because it was 3 days after my 71st birthday, and Paula had made a roast to celebrate, and Grant had come over uninvited, which by that point had started happening more and more. He brought a bottle of wine, kissed his mother on the cheek, shook my hand a little too firmly the way he always did, like he was reminding me of something, and sat down at my kitchen table with a leather portfolio tucked under his arm that he did not open. Over dinner he talked about the marina expansion, about permits that were almost through, about a business partner he was excited about. I asked polite questions the way you do with a grown man you are trying to like more than you actually do. Paula beamed at him the entire meal, the particular unguarded pride of a mother watching her only son, and I said nothing, because I loved her, and because at that point I had no reason to think there was anything beneath the surface worth testing. It was 2 weeks later, on April 2nd, that I first noticed the fog. I woke up that Wednesday morning at what I thought was 6:30, my usual hour, and found it was closer to 9. My mouth was dry in a way that felt unfamiliar, thick, almost chemical. I stood in the shower for longer than I needed to, letting the hot water hit the back of my neck, waiting for my head to clear, and it did not clear the way it should have. Paula asked if I was feeling all right over breakfast, and I told her I was fine, just old, just tired, the kind of lie a man tells himself before he tells anyone else. By the 3rd week of April, the mornings like that had become 4 or 5 a week instead of 1. I would stand in the garage sometimes and forget, for a full 10 or 15 seconds, why I had walked out there. I would reach for a word in the middle of a sentence and find nothing where the word should have been. I mentioned it to Dr. Louis Baptiste, my physician of 19 years, and he ran a basic panel, checked my thyroid, checked my blood sugar, and told me that fatigue and mild cognitive fog were extremely common in men my age, particularly men who had experienced significant grief and remarriage stress within a few years of each other. Stress, he said. The body processes loss on its own schedule. I nodded and thanked him and drove home and told myself the same thing everyone tells themselves when a professional they trust hands them an answer that is easier to accept than the alternative. What I did not know, what I could not have known without proof, was that 4 times a week, in the evenings when Paula was at her book club or her water aerobics class, Grant had begun stopping by the house to check in on me, and that those visits always, without exception, ended with him fixing me a nightcap. I want to pause here and ask you something, because I want to know I'm not the only one who's lived through a version of this. If you've ever had a family member insist on doing something small and kind for you, pouring your drink, driving you somewhere, handling your mail, and something about it felt just slightly off, even though you couldn't say why, type the word instinct in the comments below. I need to know you're still with me, because what happened next is the part that still makes my hand shake when I think about it. And a quick note before we continue, some names, dialogue, and specific details in this story have been adapted for narrative purposes. The pattern underneath it is not. The deed, though. Let's talk about the deed first, because that is where the real machinery was already turning, weeks before I ever noticed the fog in my own head. On the evening of Tuesday, May 6th, I was looking for a stamp in the drawer of the hallway credenza, the same drawer where Margaret and I had kept stamps for 30 years, and I found, tucked beneath a stack of expired coupons, a manila envelope that did not belong there. I almost didn't open it. I want to be honest about that. Some quiet, self-protective part of me almost slid it back under the coupons and went looking for my stamp somewhere else. But 41 years of finding hairline cracks in things that were supposed to hold weight does not simply switch off because you are tired and it is inconvenient. I opened it. Inside was a document titled Quitclaim Deed, County of Ashford, State Recording Stamp already affixed in the corner, dated 11 days earlier. It transferred the property at 14 Birchgate Lane, Cedar Hollow, from Walter T. Ellison to the Whitmore Family Preservation Trust. At the bottom, on the grantor's signature line, was my name, written in a hand that was close to mine, close enough to fool a stranger, close enough, I imagine, to fool a county clerk moving quickly through a stack of routine filings, but not my hand. I have signed my name perhaps 40,000 times in my life, on inspection reports, on blueprints, on Margaret's hospital paperwork in the last terrible weeks. I know the particular slant of my own W. Whoever had signed this had gotten the shape almost right and had gotten the pressure completely wrong. I sat down at the kitchen table with that envelope in my hands and felt something go very cold and very still in my chest. I did not confront anyone that night. I want to be honest about that too, because I think it matters. 41 years of engineering work teaches you one thing above almost everything else: if you shout that the bridge is cracked before you have your report finished, someone simply pours concrete over the crack and tells you that you imagined it. I put the envelope back exactly where I found it. I noted the date, the time, the recording stamp number, in a small notebook I began keeping in my nightstand drawer that same evening. And I began, very quietly, to pay attention to my own house the way I used to pay attention to a bridge after a flood. The next piece came 4 days later, on Saturday, May 10th, a little after 11 at night. Paula was asleep. I had gone downstairs for water and heard Grant's voice through the cracked door of what used to be Margaret's sewing room and was now, since Grant had started helping with paperwork, something closer to a second office. He was on the phone. I stood in the dark hallway and listened, and what I heard rearranged something permanently in the way I thought about my stepson. "He hasn't noticed anything," Grant was saying, his voice low, almost bored, the tone of a man discussing an errand rather than a human being. "He's slower than he was last year. I give it 2 months before we can get the competency evaluation scheduled without him fighting it." A pause. Then, "No, Corbin, the deed's already recorded. That part's done. We just need the guardianship to hold up if he ever tries to unwind it. Once that's in place, it doesn't matter what he says in a courtroom. Nobody listens to a man who can't remember what day it is." I stood in that hallway for a long time after he hung up, my bare feet cold against the hardwood, my heart doing something strange and heavy in my chest. Guardianship. Competency evaluation. Corbin. I did not know the name yet, not fully, but I understood, standing there in the dark, that whatever was happening to my house had already extended into a plan for what was happening to me. I went back upstairs. I did not wake Paula. I lay in the dark next to my sleeping wife and stared at the ceiling and thought about the fog in my mornings, about the nightcaps Grant kept fixing for me, and I thought, test the load. Find the crack before it becomes the reason the roof comes down. The following Monday, May 12th, I drove myself, carefully, deliberately, both hands on the wheel, to see Gerald Sorensen. Gerald had handled Margaret's estate documents 20 years earlier and had remained, in the quiet way old friendships do, someone I trusted with things I did not want to say out loud to anyone else. His office sat above a shuttered hardware store on Ash Street, 3 flights of narrow stairs that had not gotten any easier to climb since the last time I'd visited. Gerald listened to all of it without interrupting, the quitclaim deed, the forged signature, the fragment of Grant's phone call, and when I finished, he took off his glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and said something I will remember for the rest of my life. "Walter, do you remember what Margaret asked me to set up, back in 2019, after her diagnosis?" I did not exactly. I remembered signing paperwork in a hospital room, exhausted, half listening, more concerned with the oncologist's numbers than with legal architecture. Gerald opened a drawer, pulled out a thick file with Margaret's careful handwriting on the tab, and set it on the desk between us. "Your wife," Gerald said, "was smarter than either of us gave her credit for at the time. She had me draft an irrevocable protective trust that same year, not the trust Grant is claiming, an entirely separate instrument, funded with a deed to Birchgate Lane and structured so that the property could never be transferred, mortgaged, or claimed by any party without triggering an automatic freeze and a mandatory judicial review. She told me, and I remember this because it struck me as strange at the time, that she didn't want you to spend your last years defending your own front door from someone you loved." I sat in that chair and felt something in my chest that I can only describe as my late wife reaching across for years and putting her hand flat against my back to steady me. "She never told me," I said. "She asked me not to tell you unless it became necessary," Gerald said quietly. "She said if it was never necessary, she didn't want you carrying the weight of suspecting people you loved for no reason. She said if it ever was necessary, you'd know exactly what to do with it." I want to pause the story here for a moment, because I think this is the part worth sitting with. My late wife had looked at the family she was leaving behind, years before any of this happened, and had quietly built a floor beneath me in case someone ever tried to pull the real one out. If there is one thing I would ask every person watching this to take away tonight, it's this: love the people in your life fully, and still, quietly, protect what you've built. Those two things are not in conflict. Margaret proved that to me from beyond the grave. Gerald pulled a second document from the file, a certified copy of the trust, and slid it across the desk. This document supersedes the quitclaim deed entirely, he said. Whatever Grant recorded with the county, it's built on sand. The trust holds the actual title. But Walter, I need you to understand something important. Having the paperwork win in the end isn't the same as understanding what they're planning to do to you before it gets there. If there's a guardianship petition coming, if there's a plan to have you declared incompetent, we need more than a piece of paper. We need proof of intent. We need proof of what they've actually been doing to you. That was the moment the second half of this story began. Because up until then, I had been a man quietly gathering documents. What came next required me to become something closer to what I used to be on a job site, a man testing a structure to find exactly where it would fail. Gerald recommended a private investigator he had worked with twice before, a retired county sheriff's deputy named Otis Kessler, who now did discreet work for exactly this kind of situation: elder financial exploitation, contested estates, the quiet architecture of families turning on their oldest members. I met Otis on Wednesday, May 14th, at a diner off Route 9 that smelled permanently of bacon grease and burnt coffee. He was a broad, unhurried man in his early 60s with reading glasses perched on his forehead and the particular stillness of someone who has spent 30 years learning to listen more than he talks. He'd retired from the sheriff's department 11 years earlier, he told me, after his own mother had nearly signed over her farmhouse to a financial planner who turned out to have no license at all, and he said the case had never entirely left him, that it was the reason he'd built a second career doing exactly this kind of quiet, patient work for families who didn't know yet whether what they were feeling was paranoia or instinct. I told him everything. The deed. The overheard phone call. The mornings I woke up with cotton in my head. Otis wrote almost nothing down, which unsettled me at first, until I realized he was simply the kind of man who remembered everything the first time. Corbin Slate, he said, when I got to that name. I know that name. Not well, but I've heard it before, 2 counties over, connected to an elder guardianship case that got quietly settled before it ever went to trial. If it's the same man, he doesn't invent schemes. He runs the same one, over and over, on different families, adjusting the names and the paperwork each time. He leaned back. Mr. Ellison, I want to be straight with you. This isn't a spur-of-the-moment thing your stepson dreamed up. If Slate's involved, this has been engineered. Probably for longer than you think. We agreed on 3 things that afternoon. First, that I would continue behaving exactly as I always had, tired, agreeable, slightly foggy, giving Grant no reason to accelerate his timeline. Second, that Otis would begin quietly documenting Grant's financial situation, the boat brokerage, the second mortgage, anything that would establish motive. Third, and this was the part that made my stomach turn even as I agreed to it, that I would allow cameras into my own home. I called a security technician Otis recommended, a careful, soft-spoken man named Desmond Akib, who came to the house on the afternoon of Friday, May 16th while Paula was out at her hair appointment and Grant was, according to the calendar he thought I couldn't see, at a meeting with Corbin Slate. Desmond installed 4 cameras in under 90 minutes. 1 in the smoke detector above the kitchen table. 1 tucked into the spine of a hardcover encyclopedia on the living room bookshelf, angled toward the couch and the front door. 1 inside the desk lamp in what used to be Margaret's sewing room, now Grant's makeshift office. And 1, at my specific request, in the small decorative clock on the kitchen counter, aimed directly at the spot where Grant liked to stand and pour my evening drink. I watched the footage every night after that, sitting up in the dark of the guest bedroom with my laptop, Paula asleep down the hall, my hands cold around a cup of tea I never finished. Monday, May 19th, 7:52 in the evening. The kitchen camera caught Grant arriving 12 minutes after Paula left for her book club. He moved through my kitchen with an ease that made my stomach turn. He knew exactly which cabinet held the whiskey glasses, exactly how much ice I liked, exactly where I kept the bottle Paula and I had received as a wedding gift and rarely touched. He poured 2 fingers of bourbon into a glass, and then, with his back angled just slightly away from where he must have assumed a camera might be, if he had thought to assume anything at all, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and withdrew a small amber vial with no label. He tipped it, twice, over the glass. He stirred it with a spoon from the drying rack, for slow circles, the same unhurried motion of a man salting a pot of soup. It took him under 20 seconds. Then he called my name from the bottom of the stairs. Cheerful, easy, Walter, come have a drink with me before Mom gets back, and I watched myself, on that recording, come down those stairs a few minutes later and take the glass from his hand and thank him. I had, by that point, learned enough from Otis to know not to drink it that night. I told Grant my stomach was bothering me and set the glass on the counter, and later, once he had left, I poured its contents into a small sterile vial I had bought at the pharmacy for exactly this purpose, and the next morning I drove it to an independent toxicology lab 2 counties over, the way Otis had instructed me to, somewhere with no connection whatsoever to Dr. Baptiste's office or anyone else in Grant's orbit. The results came back 4 days later, on Friday, May 23rd. I sat across from Dr. Naomi Delacroix, the lab's supervising toxicologist, in a small consultation room that smelled like antiseptic and printer toner, and she slid a report across the table with one line highlighted in yellow. A benzodiazepine compound, present in a concentration consistent with repeated low-dose administration over a period of weeks, not a single acute dose. This isn't something you take once, she told me, her voice level and clinical in a way that somehow made it worse. This is a substance selected specifically because, at this dosage, it produces exactly the symptoms you've described: grogginess, memory lapses, cognitive fog, without showing up on a standard blood panel unless a physician is specifically looking for it. Whoever is administering this understands pharmacology. This is not improvisation, Mr. Ellison. This is a method. I sat in my truck in that parking lot for a long time after that appointment, the report folded in my jacket pocket, and let myself feel, for exactly as long as I could stand it, the full weight of what my stepson had been doing to me, one drink at a time. If you're still with me, and I hope you are, because the hardest part of this story is still ahead of us, type the word steady in the comments. I need to know you're here before I keep going. And a brief reminder, this account draws from real and well-documented patterns of elder drugging and guardianship fraud, but specific details have been fictionalized for the purposes of this telling. Otis's financial report arrived the same week, and it filled in the last piece of the picture. Grant's boat brokerage had lost money for 2 consecutive years. He had taken out a second mortgage against his own condominium 8 months earlier and had already fallen behind on the payments. And Corbin Slate, it turned out, operated under 3 different business names across 2 states: Slate Legacy Advisors, Ashford Senior Transition Group, and something called Whitmore Family Preservation Services, which was, Otis discovered, not a real trust administration company at all, but a shell entity Corbin had set up specifically for this house, using a name close enough to Paula's maiden name that a county clerk skimming paperwork would see nothing unusual about it. The recording that finally tied it all together came on the night of Thursday, May 29th, a little after 10 o'clock, in what used to be Margaret's sewing room. I had gone to bed early, complaining of tiredness, which by that point required no acting at all. Paula was reading in our bedroom. And downstairs, on the camera hidden in the desk lamp, Grant sat across from a man I recognized instantly from the surveillance photos Otis had shown me, silver-templed, expensively dressed, a leather portfolio identical to the one Grant had carried into my kitchen weeks before. Corbin Slate. The competency evaluation is scheduled for the 14th, Corbin was saying, his voice smooth, almost bored, the voice of a man discussing a permit application rather than a human being's freedom. Dr. Rourke owes me a favor from the Alderman case. He'll find whatever we need him to find. Once we have that on paper, the guardianship petition is a formality. The judge sees a documented cognitive decline and a devoted stepson stepping in to help. Nobody looks twice. And if he fights it? Grant asked. He's been sharper the last week. I don't know if it's the dose or if he's just having a good stretch. Increase it, Corbin said, without hesitation, without so much as a change in tone, the way you'd tell someone to turn up a thermostat. Small enough that it still reads as natural decline on a standard panel. We need him disoriented enough by the 14th that Rourke has something real to point to. After the evaluation, once guardianship is granted, the trust structure lets us liquidate the property within 90 days regardless of what he says or remembers. He won't have standing to object to anything. He won't legally be able to. I sat in the dark of the guest bedroom watching that recording with my own hands pressed flat against my knees to keep them from shaking, and I understood, finally and completely, that this had never been about a house at all. It had been about erasing my legal ability to say no to anything, ever again, while I was still alive to watch it happen. I called Otis at 11 that night. He answered on the second ring, the way men who have spent careers on call always do. I have it, I told him. All of it. Increase the dose. The competency evaluation. The doctor who owes Corbin a favor. Everything. There was a pause on the line, and then Otis said something I have thought about many times since. Walter, I want you to understand what you're holding. This isn't a family disagreement anymore. This is a documented conspiracy to have a competent adult declared incompetent through fraudulent medical evaluation, in order to seize control of his property through a forged deed. That's not a civil matter. That's criminal, on multiple counts, and it involves at least one licensed physician who needs to be reported to the state medical board regardless of anything else that happens. The last piece, the piece I had least expected and least wanted, arrived 3 days later, on Sunday, June 1st, in the form of Grant's wife, Ivy. Ivy Whitmore had married Grant 4 years earlier, a quiet, careful woman who taught 3rd grade at Cedar Hollow Elementary and who had always struck me, in the handful of holiday dinners I'd shared with her, as someone standing slightly apart from her own marriage, watching it the way you watch whether you suspect is about to turn. She called me directly, on my personal cell phone, at 8:15 that Sunday morning, her voice tight and rehearsed in the way of someone who has practiced saying something difficult many times before finally saying it. Walter, I need to talk to you. Alone. Not at the house. We met at a coffee shop in Ashford Cove, the kind of place with mismatched mugs and a chalkboard menu, and Ivy sat across from me with both hands wrapped around a cup she never drank from and told me she had found bank statements in Grant's home office 3 weeks earlier, statements showing withdrawals from an account she hadn't known existed, an account that traced, line by line, to payments made to a man named Corbin Slate. I confronted him, she said, her voice cracking slightly. He told me it was for a real estate consulting arrangement, something about helping your family with estate planning. I wanted to believe him, Walter. I really did. But then 3 nights ago I heard him on the phone, and he used the word competency, and he used your name, and something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. I've been telling myself for weeks that I was imagining things, because the alternative was believing that the man I married is trying to hurt his own stepfather. I can't keep telling myself that anymore. I told her, gently, What I already knew, because by that point I owed her the truth as much as I owed it to myself. I watched her face go through something I recognized, because I had gone through a version of it myself weeks earlier, standing in a dark hallway listening to her husband's voice through a cracked door. Grief, arriving before the death of anything except a version of a person she had built her whole married life around. "What do you need from me?" she asked, when she had steadied herself enough to speak again. "The truth," I said. "Whatever you're willing to give." Ivy agreed to speak with Detective René Castellan, an old friend of Gerald Sorensen's who had built a career in the county's financial crimes unit and who Gerald brought into the case that same week. Ivy's statement, combined with the recordings, the toxicology report, the forged deed, and Otis's financial documentation of Grant's debts, gave Detective Castellan more than enough for a warrant. But she wanted one more thing before she moved, and it was the same thing Gerald, had told me from the very beginning. She wanted them to say it themselves, in a room, with witnesses, on the record, in a way no defense attorney could later explain away as taken out of context. "We need to bring this to a head in a controlled setting," Detective Castellan told me, sitting across my own kitchen table on the evening of Wednesday, June 4th, 10 days before Grant's scheduled competency evaluation. "Somewhere you control. Somewhere with people who know you, people who will remember exactly what they saw and heard." "A dinner," I said. She nodded. "A dinner. I want to tell you honestly that deciding to invite my own family, and the people trying to destroy me, to sit at my table one final time was one of the hardest decisions I have ever made. But I thought of Margaret, of the trust she had built quietly into the walls of this house years before any of us knew it would be needed, and I thought, she gave me the floor to stand on. The least I could do was stand on it in front of everyone. We set the date for Sunday, June 8th, 6 days before the competency evaluation. Corbin Slate had already arranged with a doctor willing to lie for money. I told Grant, over the phone, in a voice I had been practicing to sound tired and defeated for weeks, that I had been thinking things over, that Paula deserved to see the family come together, that I wanted Grant and Ivy there, and that if Grant's consultant wanted to join us to discuss the paperwork properly, I would be glad to finally sit down and go over everything as a family. I could hear, even through the phone, the moment the bait was taken. His voice warmed immediately, the particular warmth of a man who believes his patience is finally about to pay off. "That sounds great, Walter," he said. "I'll let Corbin know. We'll get everything squared away." I spent the days before that dinner exactly the way I had spent the 6 weeks before it, pretending, carefully, to be exactly the confused, softening old man they believed they had already won. It was, without question, the hardest performance of my life, made bearable only by Otis's quiet daily check-ins and by Gerald's steady reminder, repeated almost like a mantra, that the truth does not need to be rushed. It only needs to be complete. On the morning of Sunday, June 8th, I invited for additional guests to that dinner without telling Grant. Reverend Pratt, who had walked with me through the worst year of my life and who I wanted at that table simply so there would be one person in the room whose presence reminded me why any of this mattered. Otis Kessler, introduced simply as an old friend. Detective René Castellan, off-duty, dressed in ordinary clothes, seated where she could see both Grant and Corbin without appearing to watch either one. And Ivy, who arrived early, pale and steady, and squeezed my hand at the door and said only, "I'm ready." Paula set the table with the good china we had received as a wedding gift 3 years earlier and used perhaps a dozen times since. She had no idea, that afternoon, what the evening actually was. I want to be honest that this was, and remains, one of the parts of this story I have made the most peace with the slowest. But I had learned enough from Gerald and from Otis and, in a strange way, from Margaret's careful, quiet planning years before her death, to understand that protecting someone from an uncomfortable truth is not the same thing as protecting them. Reverend Pratt arrived first, at 6 o'clock sharp, and clasped both my hands at the door the way he always did, saying nothing about what he already knew was coming, simply holding my grip a beat longer than a normal greeting required. Otis Kessler came next, in a plain brown jacket, introduced to the table as an old friend from my engineering days, which was not entirely a lie, since by that point he had become exactly that. Detective Castellan arrived at 6:15 in jeans and a cardigan, her badge tucked into her handbag rather than clipped to her belt, and took the seat at the far end of the table Otis had quietly steered her toward earlier that afternoon, a seat with a clear line of sight to both the front door and the chair where Corbin Slate would eventually sit. Ivy came at 6:20, pale, composed at a cost I could see in the set of her jaw, and when she took my hand at the door she held it a moment longer than the greeting required, the way Reverend Pratt had. "I'm ready," she said quietly, and I believed her. Grant and Corbin arrived together at 6:30, Grant relaxed and smiling in a way that made my chest tighten, Corbin in an expensive grey suit, carrying his leather portfolio like a man arriving to close a deal he had already priced in his head. Corbin's eyes moved across the room the moment he stepped inside, the practiced scan of a man checking for anything unexpected, and I watched him find Detective Castellan's face, pause on it for exactly half a second longer than a polite guest would, and then move past it, his smile never wavering. He had not expected an unfamiliar face in this room. It did not stop him. Men like Corbin Slate have learned to keep smiling straight through the moment they realize the ground has shifted, because stopping is the only thing that gives them away before they're ready to be given away. We sat down. Reverend Pratt offered a short grace. The conversation moved through the ordinary things families discuss when they are pretending very hard to be a family: Ivy's classroom, the weather, Grant's marina expansion that was, he assured everyone, almost through permitting. I ate my dinner. I let my hands shake slightly, the way they had been shaking for weeks whether I wanted them to or not, and I let Grant see exactly the tired, softening old man he had spent 2 months manufacturing. At 7:45, I set down my fork, and I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket, and I placed the first envelope on the white tablecloth. "I want to tell all of you a story," I said. "It starts on a Tuesday evening in March, with a bottle of wine and a folder Grant never opened." Grant's smile faltered. "Walter, what is this?" "This," I said, "is the truth. And it's been waiting long enough." I opened the first envelope and set the quitclaim deed in front of him, my forged signature circled in red ink. "This was recorded with the county on April 25, I said. "It transfers this house into something called the Whitmore Family Preservation Trust. I never signed it. I have never seen this document in my life until I found it hidden in a drawer in my own hallway." I watched Corbin's expression sharpen into something colder and more focused, the salesman's warmth draining out of his face in real time. I opened the second envelope. The toxicology report, one line highlighted in yellow. "For 6 weeks, I said, I have been drugged in my own kitchen. I have the lab results. I have the substance, the concentration, and the pattern of repeated administration. And I have this." I placed my phone in the center of the table and pressed play. Grant's voice filled the dining room, tinny but unmistakable. "Increase the dose. Small enough that it reads as natural decline. We need him disoriented enough by the 14th. Corbin's voice, answering, calm and businesslike, discussing a doctor who owed him a favor, discussing my competency evaluation like a line item on an invoice. Paula made a sound I have never heard a human being make before or since, something between a gasp and a sob, both hands flying to her mouth. Grant shot to his feet, his chair scraping hard against the floor. "Dad, you don't understand the context, I can explain." "Sit down, Grant," Detective Castellan said, and it was the first time her voice had left the register of a polite dinner guest. Grant sat, his face the color of old paper. I opened the third envelope, Gerald's certified copy of Margaret's protective trust, and slid it across the table to Corbin's slate. "The deed you recorded is worthless," I told him. "It always was. My late wife protected this house for years before you ever heard my name." Corbin's mask cracked for exactly 1 second, and in that second I saw, very clearly, the calculation behind his eyes rearranging itself, looking for an exit that was no longer there. Ivy stood then, her chair scraping back, her voice trembling but clear enough to carry across the whole table. "My name is Ivy Whitmore," she said. "I'm Grant's wife. I found the payments to Corbin's slate 3 weeks ago. I heard the phone call about the competency evaluation. I've given a statement to Detective Castellan, and I stand by every word of it." Grant's face, when he turned to look at his own wife, was the face of a man watching the last floor beneath him give way. Detective Castellan stood, badge lifted, and read the charges in a clear, level voice: conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery of a real property instrument, administering a controlled substance without consent, and conspiracy to obtain guardianship through fraudulent medical evaluation. 2 officers she had stationed outside came through the front door on her signal. Corbin's slate said nothing at all, his expression settling into a blank, practiced stillness, the look of a man who has been caught before and knows exactly how little there is left to say. Grant said my name once, quietly, almost like a question, as the officer turned him toward the wall, and I looked at my stepson and felt something I had not expected to feel in that moment. Not triumph. Not satisfaction. Just the specific, permanent stillness of a man who has finally set down a weight he has been carrying without fully admitting it, for a very long time. The door closed behind them at 8:19 that evening. The dining room was very quiet after that. Paula sat with her hands pressed flat against the tablecloth, staring at nothing, and I crossed the room and knelt beside her chair and told her, as gently as I knew how, that none of this was her fault, that she had raised a son the best way she knew how, and that whatever Grant had become, he had become it on his own. 5 months passed the way months pass after something that breaks the world into a before and an after, not quickly, not painlessly, but with a kind of relentless forward motion that does not wait for your permission to keep going. Dr. Elliot Rourke, the physician Corbin had arranged to falsify my competency evaluation, was reported to the state medical board the same week and had his license suspended pending a full investigation once Detective Castellan's team subpoenaed his communications with Corbin's slate. It turned out I was not the first name in that exchange. 2 other elderly patients, in 2 other counties, had already been through evaluations Dr. Rourke had signed off on for Corbin's associates, and both of those families were contacted as part of the widening investigation. Otis Kessler's financial documentation, combined with county records in a neighboring jurisdiction, revealed that Corbin's slate had run some version of this scheme at least 4 times over the previous 9 years, always with a financially desperate adult child, always with a paid-off house, always with the same 3-step architecture, a forged transfer, a manufactured medical decline, and a guardianship petition time to arrive just as the family member's disorientation reached its engineered peak. Detective Castellan called me on the afternoon of Friday, July 11th, with a voice that told me before her words did that the case had grown larger than the walls of my own dining room. "Walter," she said, "we found 2 more. A widower outside Millhaven, 82 years old, who lost partial use of a leg after a fall his family attributed to age, and it turns out he'd been on the same benzodiazepine pattern for 4 months before his son-in-law filed for guardianship. And a woman in Pruitt County, 91, whose granddaughter used almost the identical forged trust language slate used on you. Both cases had been quietly settled out of court, no charges, no public record. If you hadn't installed those cameras, Walter, if you hadn't had the toxicology run independently, we would very likely be adding your name to that same quiet list instead of standing here with a case strong enough to take to a jury." I sat with that for a long time after she hung up. 2 other families. Two other old men and women who had trusted the wrong smile at the wrong kitchen table, and who had never had a wife thoughtful enough, for years before her own death, to build a trust nobody else knew existed. It is the reason I agreed, later that summer, to let the county's Elder Protective Services Unit use an anonymized version of my case in their volunteer training materials. If one investigator somewhere recognizes the pattern a season earlier because of what happened in my kitchen, then something good came out of all of it beyond my own house staying mine. The grand jury returned indictments against Grant, Corbin Slate, and Dr. Rourke on the same afternoon, September 2nd, and the case moved to trial faster than Gerald had predicted, in part because the prosecutor, a sharp, unhurried woman named Assistant District Attorney Priya Ramanathan, wanted the recordings and the toxicology timeline in front of a jury while the evidence was still fresh and uncontested. Grant's trial began on a Tuesday morning in late October, in a courtroom I had never expected to sit in as anything other than an occasional juror decades earlier. I testified for the better part of a day, walking the jury through the deed, the phone call I overheard in a dark hallway, the toxicology report, the recording from the sewing room. ADA Ramanathan played the audio for the jury 3 separate times, and each time I watched at least one juror's face change in the same way mine must have changed the night I first heard it in the dark of my guest bedroom, the particular stillness of someone realizing a man can plan another man's disappearance in the same calm voice he uses to order dinner. Ivy testified the following day, her voice steady even as she described the moment she realized the man she had built a marriage with had agreed to drug his own stepfather for a house. She told the jury about finding the bank statements, about the 3 sleepless nights before she finally called me, about sitting across from Detective Castellan and understanding that whatever came next, she could not unknow what she now knew. Dr. Naomi Delacroix testified about the toxicology findings with the same clinical precision she'd shown me in that consultation room months earlier, explaining to 12 strangers exactly why a substance like the one found in my blood work is chosen specifically because it hides from a standard panel. Otis Kessler walked the jury through Grant's financial collapse, the second mortgage, the missed payments, the calls to Corbin Slate that began 8 months before I ever noticed a single missing hour of my own morning. Corbin Slate's defense attorney tried, on cross-examination, to paint the entire case as the fabrication of a grieving, paranoid old man clinging to control after his first wife's death. I looked at him the way I used to look at a bridge inspection report that didn't add up. I spent 41 years finding the cracks other people missed, I told him. This one wasn't hard to find. It was hiding in my own hallway drawer. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they filed back in, I remember gripping the edge of the wooden bench so hard my knuckles went white, Paula's hand cold in mine on one side, Ivy sitting stiff and silent on the other. Grant was convicted on all counts: conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery of a real property instrument, administering a controlled substance without consent, and conspiracy to obtain guardianship through fraudulent means. At sentencing 3 weeks later, Judge Melina Whitfield, no relation to my stepson's family, a coincidence that struck me as strange the moment I heard her name read into the record, looked directly at Grant before pronouncing sentence and said something I have carried with me since. Mr. Whitmore, the court has heard a great deal about financial desperation in this trial, offered as explanation, though never quite as excuse. Desperation explains why a man might ask for help. It does not explain 11 weeks of calculated, incremental drugging of a man who welcomed you into his home and called you son. She sentenced him to 11 years, with parole eligibility after 7. Corbin Slate, whose prior pattern across multiple counties weighed heavily against him at sentencing, and whose refusal to show even a flicker of remorse throughout both his own trial and the 2 additional civil cases quietly filed against him by the families in Millhaven and Pruitt County, received 19 years. Dr. Elliot Rourke lost his medical license permanently and pleaded guilty to a lesser charge in exchange for cooperating fully with the broader investigation into Slate's other victims, cooperation that Detective Castellan told me directly was instrumental in finally connecting all three cases into a single prosecutable pattern instead of three isolated, unrelated tragedies. I sold nothing. That matters to me, and I want to say it plainly. The house on Birchgate Lane still stands exactly where Margaret and I built it in 1987, still holds her rose garden along the side fence, still has her handwriting taped inside the pantry door listing the correct order to load the dishwasher, a habit of hers I never had the heart to argue with while she was alive and have never once considered removing since. Paula and I repainted the porch railing together last spring, the two of us out there on a Saturday with old brushes and a can of white paint, not saying very much, simply working side by side the way people do when they've decided, together, that a thing is worth keeping. Paula and I are still married. I will not pretend the last 5 months have been easy on her, because they have not. She visits Grant twice a month, and I have never once asked her not to, because whatever he did to me, he is still her son, and grief for the person someone used to be does not disappear simply because a jury reaches a verdict. What I will say is that Paula has never, for one single day since that dinner, doubted what I showed her on that table. She held my hand through every day of that trial, and some nights, when the house is quiet and I still catch myself checking the hallway drawer out of old habit, she is the one who reminds me that the crack has already been found and repaired, and that the house is standing exactly the way it was built to stand. Ivy filed for divorce 3 weeks after the arrest and has, since then, become something between a friend and an unlikely extension of my own family. She still teaches 3rd grade in Cedar Hollow. She still calls me on Sunday afternoons, the way Grant once did, except her calls, unlike his, never once made me feel like I was being measured for something. In January, Reverend Pratt asked whether I would be willing to speak at a small gathering the church basement now hosts every other Wednesday evening, a support circle for older adults navigating exactly this kind of betrayal, forged documents, manipulated medications, guardianship threats dressed up as concern. I said yes before I had fully thought it through, and I am glad I did not think it through, because thinking too hard about it might have talked me out of walking back into that same basement where I met Paula, this time to tell strangers about the worst 6 weeks of my life. The first night, there were 5 of us in folding chairs around a coffee urn that badly needed replacing. A woman named Constance, 84, whose nephew had convinced her to add him to her checking account just for emergencies, 2 years before she noticed $4,000 had quietly disappeared. A man named Gerald Odom, 76, whose daughter-in-law had been slowly relabeling his prescription bottles. By March, the circle had grown to 11 people, and by June, we had moved into the church's larger fellowship hall because the basement could no longer hold everyone who showed up. Otis Kessler comes some weeks and talks, in his slow, unhurried way, about what documentation actually looks like, dates, times, receipts, independent lab results, the unglamorous paperwork that turns a suspicion into a case a prosecutor can actually use. Detective Castellan comes when her schedule allows and reminds everyone, gently but firmly, that reporting a family member is not a betrayal of love. It is very often the only thing left that still counts as love, once trust itself has already been broken by the other person. If this story has taught me anything, and I have had a great deal of time these last months to sit with what it taught me, it is this. Love does not require blindness, and family does not require silence. I loved Grant, in whatever complicated, blended family way a stepfather loves a grown stepson he did not raise from birth, and that love did not stop me from installing cameras in my own kitchen or driving a vial of my own drugged bourbon to a lab 2 counties away. Those two things were never in conflict. The people who tell you that protecting yourself and loving your family cannot exist in the same house have usually never had to find out the hard way that they can. Test the load before you trust the structure. That is the rule I built a career on, and it is the rule that saved my house, my sanity, and very possibly my life. If something in your own family feels slightly off, a document that appears without explanation, a drink that leaves you foggier than it should, a sudden interest in your finances dressed up as concern. Do not talk yourself out of what you are noticing simply because the person doing it shares your last name or calls you dad. Document it. Get an outside opinion from a lab, a lawyer, a friend who has no stake in the outcome. And remember that the people who love you best sometimes protect you long after they're gone, the way my late wife protected me from 4 years in the past, quietly, without ever needing thanks for it. I want to leave you with a few things I have learned, plainly, the way I would say them to my own reflection if I could reach back 6 months and warn myself before any of this started. First, a neighbor noticing a pattern is not gossip. Doris Okafor mentioning a car in my driveway on the same 2 evenings every week felt, at the time, like small talk over a mailbox. It was the first thread of the entire unraveling. Do not wave away the people who notice things about your life that you have stopped noticing yourself. Second, unexplained fatigue is a symptom, not a sentence. 2 doctors, in my case only one, but in cases like mine generally more than one, will tell a grieving older adult that fog and tiredness are simply what age and sorrow look like. Sometimes that is true. Ask anyway for the tests that specifically rule out what you cannot see on a routine panel. It costs an afternoon. It can save everything else. Third, paperwork that moves quietly is more dangerous than paperwork that moves loudly. Grant never once asked me to sign anything directly. That was the point. A forged signature filed quietly with a county clerk does more damage, faster, than a document waved in your face ever could, because it depends entirely on nobody looking until it is too late to easily undo. Fourth, protecting yourself is not the same as accusing someone. I did not confront Grant the night I found that deed in the credenza drawer. I gathered proof first. A courtroom, and frankly a family, both respond far better to a complete picture than to a raw accusation made in anger before you have anything to back it up. Fifth, and this is the one I return to most often, love someone fully and still build a floor beneath yourself. Margaret did both, for years before she died, without ever making me feel like she doubted the family we had built together. That is not contradiction. That is wisdom, offered quietly enough that I did not even recognize it as a gift until I needed it most. If there's a version of my late wife's letter in your own life, a document, a trust, a hard conversation you've been putting off having with someone you love about how your affairs are structured, do not wait for a crisis to have it. Have it on an ordinary Tuesday, while everyone at the table still loves each other without complication. If this story meant something to you tonight, I would love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me what part of this stayed with you the longest, and tell me, honestly, what you would have done differently in my place. If you haven't subscribed yet, please consider it. These stories exist because people like you keep showing up for them, and every comment, every share, every subscription tells me that stories like this one are still worth telling. Thank you, truly, for staying with me through all of it tonight. One final note before I go. This account was inspired by real, well-documented patterns of elder financial abuse, forged property transfers, and medication-based manipulation used to manufacture false incompetency findings, patterns that affect thousands of families every year. Certain names, dialogue, and specific details in this telling have been dramatized for storytelling purposes. If stories like this aren't the kind of content you're looking for tonight, I understand completely, and I hope you find something else on this channel that serves you better. For everyone else, take care of yourselves, take care of the people who've earned your trust, and never be afraid to check the foundation, even in the house you built with your own hands.